Welcome everybody to our panel on Money for Resiliency, the Promise of Adaptation Funding. We have a great panel here this morning. We're going to have all of them give a short presentation, and then I'll have some questions for the panel, and then I'll open it up for questions from our audience today. My name is Kate Sheppard. I'm an energy and environment editor and reporter at the Huffington Post. I cover mostly politics and policy here in the US, but I get to do international coverage as well. So I'm excited to hear from the panel today. First up, I'll introduce the whole panel first, and then we'll have them come up individually. To my left, I have Marcia Levaggi, who's manager of the UN Adaptation Fund. To her left, we have Bennett Freeman, who's the senior vice president for sustainability, research and policy at Calvert Investments. Then we have Emerson Resende, independent consultant, climate change and sustainability expert. And we have Richard Saines, who is the principal at Baker and McKenzie LLP. So first, Marcia will give us a presentation and overview on the UN Adaptation Fund.
Thank you very much. Well, for those who are not familiar with the Adaptation Fund, I'm going to go briefly over the main features of it. The Adaptation Fund was established under the Kyoto Protocol and became operational in 2010. So far, we have funded 29 projects in all countries that parties to the Kyoto Protocol and are considered developing countries. 29 countries have accessed resources from the fund, and we have allocated 200 million so far. The fund presents some innovative features, and one of these was that initially the fund was supposed to be funded by a percentage of the proceeds of the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. So for some time until November 2011, when the price of carbon started dropping, the fund ran basically on the proceeds of the monetization of CRs. And up to date, we have 190 million in our trust fund that came from this source. However, after 2011, the composition of the capital of the fund changed dramatically, and we had to rely more on donor contributions, donor countries' contributions. And at the moment, we have 150 million raised from donor countries, and which are basically European countries. And at the last COP in Warsaw, we have received pledges for 72 million additional that are coming into the trust fund, hopefully by end of this year. And with that, we have met the fundraising target that the fund had established for end of 2013. It's a small fund. It's a fund that funds adaptation to climate change. And one of the challenges the board of the fund, the board that manages this fund, which is composed by a majority of developing countries, faced after the drop in the prices of CRs was how to diversify the sources of funding. We have the possibility to receive donations from the private sector, from private donors, small or big donors. We have, through the UN Foundation, a donation facility to channel small donations. And one of the new paths we are exploring now is how to engage the private sector in funding the Adaptation Fund. The Adaptation Fund, one of the characteristics that makes it unique is that offers the possibility for entities, national entities in developing countries to access funding from the fund directly. This is without the intermediation of MDBs or UN organizations, which is also a possibility. usual suspects can access funds from the Adaptation Fund, and we have 10 multilateral implementing entities accredited with the fund. But in addition to this, we have 15 national implementing entities in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and the region that is less represented is Asia. But out of these 15 entities, 5 have already accessed funding from the Adaptation Fund. We have 5 projects under implementation through the direct access modality. And we are launching a readiness program to help these entities this next year that has been approved by the Adaptation Fund Board. The accreditation of these national entities is done through an assessment made by an accreditation panel of experts that assess their fiduciary standards, whether they meet certain fiduciary standards, and now one new addition is their capacity to implement the environmental and social policy approved by the Adaptation Fund Board. So this is, in a nutshell, the situation of the Adaptation Fund and its features, and I will be happy to answer your questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Bennett Freeman
Thank you.
of Calvert Investments.
Good morning, or almost afternoon, and delighted to be back at GAIN. This is a tremendously important international initiative, and delighted to see it move forward now, housed at Notre Dame, my old friend David Lodge. And I just want to start right off with my brief remarks here to hit on the head why we at Calvert Investments care about climate adaptation and resilience. We're the largest family of sustainable and responsible mutual funds based in the United States, and we've long been concerned about climate change, both on the mitigation and adaptation sides of the equation, but we've seen in climate change both really the greatest global sustainability challenge of the 21st century, but also at the same time, one of the major emerging investment opportunities of the 21st century. So our approach to climate change has focused both on the investment and the public policy sides, and I'll just spend a couple minutes on both. First and foremost, I want to emphasize the importance of sufficient finance for climate adaptation and resilience, and really salute the efforts of the UN fund. Absolutely critically important. But that effort and others that are underway around the world have to be complemented and reinforced by robust private sector investment. At Calvert, we've tried to do our part. The last half dozen years or so, we launched in 2007 a Global Alternative Energy Fund. In late 2008, maybe the timing wasn't wonderful, but a Global Water Sustainability Fund that has done extraordinarily well the last couple of years. In particular, is the investment thesis around water sustainability, water infrastructure, particularly in a climate adaptation context, has gained traction both in the OECD and developing economies around the world. More recently, we've launched emerging market sustainability funds, and most recently, just 5 weeks ago, a green bond fund, which was inspired partly by the efforts of the World Bank in that particular space. And we're very excited about some of our initial investments in the green bond space, including investments in bonds put out by General Electric for some of its water projects, including those with a major impact in Africa. We've also been very pleased that in our initial tranche of investments in the Green Bond Fund that we've been able to support the new Africa Climate Adaptation Fund that really has a lot of promise for efforts in a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, both supported by governments and by the private sector in a number of countries to address climate adaptation resilience efforts on that continent, where the convergence of climate and water is particularly acute, not only in an environmental context, but also in a humanitarian, human rights, and regional conflict and humanitarian context as well. We see in the climate adaptation and resilience theme a real convergence of many of our longstanding interests, not only in climate and the environment, but also the social policy outcomes that we hope to see, particularly around poverty alleviation and empowerment of poorer countries. So that's the investment side of the equation for us. We hope that even these modest efforts of ours will prove to complement others, set an example for others who may be able to bring even more capital to bear. And we're particularly excited about the innovation embodied in that new green bonds funds of ours. We're also extraordinarily active in the public policy arena around both climate mitigation and adaptation, both in the United States, at the state and especially the federal level here in Washington, but also internationally. We are a founding member of PREP, the Partnership for Resilience and Environmental Preparedness. We work particularly closely with Oxfam America in that important coalition, together with a number of other companies that have come together under the banners of Ceres and BICEP, who recognize not only the environmental importance of dealing with climate adaptation and resilience, but also the competitive advantages, and for us in turn, the investment opportunities that can flow here. We wrote to President Obama just 6 weeks ago on the anniversary of Sandy, calling on him and the administration to carry out their commitments made last June in the climate blueprint for the second administration to fund more robustly climate resilience and adaptation efforts. And without claiming credit, we were delighted to see the executive order just several days later on November 3rd that in fact does provide significant new funding in areas related to climate adaptation, flood control, risk management, and so forth. We're very heartened by that. I want to end my very brief remarks by repeating something I think I probably said when I spoke at a GAIN event here in Washington a year and a half or 2 years ago, I think, about the broader context, political context, if you will, in which we see climate adaptation. And that is that it is an absolute imperative that we continue to move forward at an accelerated rate now on adaptation and resilience efforts, harnessing the commitments and capabilities of the public and private sectors alike, private investors as well as public investment that's so important, both on the multilateral level and the state-specific level. But in no way can we allow the adaptation agenda to substitute for, supplant in any way the mitigation agenda. And many of us have been frustrated by the slow pace of progress on climate mitigation, not least here in the United States, but also through the international process shepherded by the United Nations. And we really do see climate adaptation and mitigation as being two sides of the same coin, and we need to move them forward together, not one without the other, but together both at the same time. And with that conviction, I think that we can really make significant progress here on resilience, even as we continue to keep a strong focus on mitigation at the same time. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next, we have Emerson Resende.
Hello, everybody. Just want to start thanking the organizer of the event for inviting me. It's a big pleasure, and I'm truly honored to be here. So thanks to Joyce, to Ian, to the gang, of course, and also to congratulate everybody for organizing the event. It's extremely well organized. The panels are extremely rich, and I feel that my contribution is not close to anybody that has been talking before me. But let's put that to the side and start talking about private sector engagements and adaptation. Before working as a consultant, I was working for the UN Climate Change Organization in Bonn, on the policy side. And I remember yesterday Dr. Labub talking about you saying the words adaptation around some places and getting some reactions from people. I think it was 2009, just after the conference in Copenhagen that you probably recall. If you said the terms of private sector in any UN corridor in Bonn, people would shut the door on you and they would ask you to leave their premises, not talk about that close to them. When I started doing the work there to engage private sector, to talk about adaptation, not long after, GAIN came up, and GAIN was a blast for my work because GAIN basically made my life easier to approach people and talk about that. And I can only commend GAIN for that. And every time I talk to governments or private organizations, if they're not aware of that, that's one of the first things that I refer to, because it's a way for them to visualize something that's very hard to make it tangible. We know that climate change mitigation you can quantify, you can trade, you can buy offsets, sell offsets, and adaptation is completely different. It's another animal. But let me get to the point that I was asked to talk about, which is the private sector perspective on adaptation. My challenge back then in 2009 and 10 was, how can I get any company talking about private sector, talking about adaptation, if they're not even perceive things that way? I remember inviting Ian was in that event, if I'm not wrong, invited the CEO of a major telecom organization to talk about their particular activities in addressing climate change risks in their operations. It was a vice president of sustainability talking about it, and he spent about half an hour talking everything about climate change, but adaptation, everything that they were doing to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, which is fantastic. Of course, we have to understand that. But I invited them because I knew that they were doing some activities to reduce vulnerability, to increase their resilience. And later on, the audience was posing questions, and the questions to this person was, of course, but hold on, aren't you guys doing anything on adaptation? And they couldn't talk much about it. And then I understood that that was an issue of communication as well. And I started doing some work on research and trying to understand what companies around the world, different sectors, different sizes, different places, what they were doing that was related to reduce vulnerability to their operations, to their supply chain, physical assets, and so on. And I found a number of examples that were in the public domain. I tried to put that in a sort of database model, something very simplistic. My manager didn't give me any funds, and he said, I don't want you here, you do that work. If you want to do it, don't tell me. It took me about a year or so to convince him that we should put that online. Now it's a live database that resides on the UNFCCC website. I can tell you more later about that. But we have over 200 cases, concrete case studies that's showing that private companies went out there, they did climate change adaptation work with two main ideas in the mind when they did that work. do it for profitability and sustainability reasons, not for CSR, not because we want to be seen as a nice organization that is putting some money to help any poor community in an African country or any other place. No, we did it because it is profitable, sustainable, makes completely sense for the investment points of view. We are protecting our assets. We are increasing resilience in our supply chain. We are guaranteeing supply. And this makes sense, makes a business sense for us. So all these studies about that, showing that companies went out there and did this sort of work. And then comes the other side of the story, which is the public side. How can governments create the incentives for private organizations to do more? How can I use public funds to leverage private sector funds? Because this is going to be a fundamental question with the Green Climate Fund. You know, government's talking about $100 billion per year from 2020. We never heard any government talking about that. The World Bank doesn't have that money on a yearly basis. We will never see any government disbursing that money. So that's a collection of efforts, and the private sector is going to be heading that. I don't want to go much into that because I think that's a completely different animal. But just concentrating here on the private sector examples, I just want to share with you a couple of examples of private companies that are listed on this database that I mentioned. I will start with two that were awarded with the GAIN prize this morning. PepsiCo, if I'm not wrong, we should have about 2 or if not 3 examples of their work in this database. They were flooding us with case studies because they're doing great work. One of these examples is in Peru. Is a very interesting example. They have these little packs of chips there, potato chips, and they work with the community where they get the potatoes from the farmers there, and then they manufacture the chips. They understood, after the assessments, that the production was going to decrease in quantity and in quality in that area because of water stress issues and other climate change risks, if you want to say. So what did they do? Well, we need to find a solution for this. What's cost effectively, what's easier for us? Is it better for us to import potato from another South American country? No. Is it easier for us to stop producing these products and find another product? No. Is it easier for us to partner up with a research organization and help them to develop potatoes that are more drought resilient, for example? Yes, that makes economic sense for us. Let's do that. So they engage in that sort of example. I could spend 3 days talking to you of another thousands of examples of private companies doing that. Why don't we hear this in the context of climate change adaptation? Because this is a competitiveness issue as well. I'm not going to tell everybody what I am doing, because for me it's important that I keep this in the core of my business. So I do that through CSR, perhaps, releasing some statements here and there. Another example. I did some work a few years ago in Ivory Coast. Ivory Coast probably heard yesterday through Perry talking about cocoa production. Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, it's the largest producer of cocoa in the world. They produce nearly 40% of cocoa that we see. So every chocolate that you eat, probably there's a little bit of cocoa from Ivory Coast. I was asked to go there and do a climate change assessment of the vulnerability of the country, particularly in this industry. Why in Ivory Coast and not in Ghana? Well, because Ivory Coast is a major producer, and because nobody have ever attempted to do anything like this. I will try to be quick here because I'm aware of time. You have no idea how these people do the plantation of cocoa. The trees that are supposed to have a lifespan of about 25 to 30 years producing at the fullest, they were keeping them for 60 years. After 35 years there, if you really kept a good conservation and management activities, they would already be decreasing their production. These trees there, they were at least 50 years old. The farmers themselves, they're over 60 years old in many instances. The size of these farms, they're not more than 3 hectares average. You know, this is tiny. basically is myself here having my little farm with my wife and another 4 kids. Over there, there's my neighbor doing the same. Once we see that the trees are old, we just go around chopping them. We chop them. What we do now is we get a bunch of seeds, we close our eyes, and we throw them, and we wait a couple of years to see that tree growing. So to give you a perspective of the scale here of the issue, you have to look into the economics, because a company sitting in Europe or in the US or in any other country producing chocolates, they're going to care about the price of chocolates in the stock markets. To put numbers here on the table, the price of cocoa went from about roughly $800 a ton to a spike of $3,500 in a span of less than a year, a few years ago. Why that? Well, there are a number of drivers. Climate change is a component because there are a lot of interest behind this. So to summarize is, how can we provide a solution for this from making economic sense? Well, you have to get the players on the table. Nestlé went there. They established a research center in Abidjan, the south of the country. They were partnered up and working with the local government to develop planteds that were more drought resilient. They were teaching farmers on how to plant because they have an economic interest on that. So the list is long and extensive. The final example, very quickly, is roads construction, transport sector, infrastructure. I was involved with an organization in Europe that was looking into transport sector, resilience for transport sector. And you see a number of construction organizations, companies, developing new technologies in asphalt, for example, that are more permeable, or talking with engineers to understand how that zone is going to be impacted by more rain or less rain. But you see this happening. We just need to put that into the perspective of climate change adaptation. And I think it's happening. And again, I compliment GAIN for the fantastic work that they lead. And I really hope to see more of this coming up in the future. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you, Emerson. And now we have Richard Saines from Baker & McKenzie, LLP.
Hi, thank you. Okay. Let me just thank ND GAIN for inviting me to come speak, and really happy to be here, see old friends, and learn again from another fantastic assembly of experts that are on the cutting edge of trying to solve some of these problems that we all share. These are shared responsibilities. They're collective action problems. They're new because they're at a scale that we haven't really seen before, and they also penetrate so many aspects of all of our lives and global commerce, well-being, stability, livelihoods. And so, it's very difficult to find the solution. So many times we have problems that we think there's an answer for, and we should just get the answer, implement the answer, and the problem's solved. And we move on. But the issue of climate change and the issue of population growth, all of the things we've talked about over the last day and a half here, are creating an environment in which the problems require fundamentally new and more committed solutions and ideas than what we're used to doing as a collective people. So the issue of what role governments play, what role the public sector plays in mobilizing capital, and things like the Adaptation Fund and the way in which that was envisioned, because that, frankly, was an interesting innovation to take proceeds from the sale of the CERs, which was a private sector funded policy, and use that to create the Adaptation Fund. But we've seen that anytime you create policies, those policies are stressed over time. And so on the mitigation side, we're still struggling to actually have the policy implementation that's going to drive the physical change and the mitigation change on the ground sufficient to address the climate change problem. It's a journey, it's a process, and we're working through it. We continue to work through it. I couldn't agree more with you, Bennett, that this is not an either-or issue. It's a shared responsibility. It's a collective action issue. And not only because though some folks may have the view that mitigation is really important, it's important in the context of adaptation, because to the extent you subscribe to the view that greenhouse gases are contributing to increased risks of climate change, that then increases vulnerability. And it's the vulnerability and that risk that we're trying to address with adaptation. So you have to focus on both. You have to address both simultaneously. And we're doing that as a collective. And I'm really pleased to see that adaptation is becoming more prominent thanks to the leadership of GAIN in part, and really trying to drive that message forward. It's very important. So when it comes to private sector, I mean, one of the things at Baker McKenzie, we're a law firm, and we've been involved in this issue of climate change and the policy response to it and the economic response to it, and how private sector companies can undertake transactions and investments and yield return on those investments for a long time. And what we're struggling with now as well is to try to figure out what is the return on investment for adaptation. There are excellent examples within the corporate context of corporate finance and folks like Pepsi and those that are exposed to the agricultural sector and their supply chains, or the water sector, or the energy sector. And all of those you can figure out, and you can identify a measurable, tangible return on investment for a corporately funded undertaking. The likes of which the GE water solutions is a good example. But the real question is, I think, we know the scale of the problem, and we know that the scale of the problem is beyond what we have the current capacity to deal with. So we are being outpaced. We are losing the battle if we look at a snapshot today. We need to change the way in which we respond to this issue. And the way we need to change it is by being much more integrated and coordinated, so we leverage the collective action and the shared responsibility that governments have, that civil society has, that academic institutions have, and that the private sector has. It's not somebody else's responsibility. It's all of our responsibility to address it. So I think the fundamental questions then become, what specifically are we talking about when we talk about adaptation or climate resiliency? We have to break those down into measurable, identifiable, and traceable metrics, which is a very important component of enabling then the policy infrastructure and the economic and finance infrastructure to start to talk in a common language. I mean, one of the things, Bennett, that's really critical in your business, and I'm a lawyer, so I like to talk about contracts, are standardization. Getting on the same page, understanding the language. If you don't have the right language, and we talk past each other when we talk about resiliency and adaptation and metrics and private sector, what is the private sector? I mean, the private sector is not one thing. It's a whole milieu of different activity. Right. We need to start to really have that conversation and get to the common understanding, so that we can create the financial models, the financial innovations to mobilize and move the broadly defined capital markets towards the solution side and not the exacerbation of the risk side. And it's happening organically because companies see the vulnerability within their own supply chains and their own assets. It needs to be expanded out to become much more of a universal conversation in the financial community as a whole, so that we can then apply and move the needle and shift a lot more private sector capital markets investments towards climate resiliency and mitigation. And to do that, we need some standardization and common language around what it is we're actually trying to solve, and break it down, measure it, track it, and then value it. So I'll stop there. Look forward to the conversation. Thank you.